As the 15th century dawned, the landmass called the Iberian Peninsula had already seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Romans, Greeks, Goths, and others left behind the complex puzzle of competing kingdoms. Granada was the remaining bastion of Muslim rule. Early in the 8th century, the Muslims of Arabia had completed an explosive dynastic expansion. They conquered North Africa and converted multitudes of Moors to their faith. The combined force set their sights on Iberia and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to conquer her fertile plains.
Gradually and across the centuries, the Christian kingdoms expanded their territorial domains at the expense of the Muslims until to the point that by the end of the 13th or early 14th century, only the Granada in the very south remained in Moorish hands. Despite their reduced political importance, their cultural importance was immense.
Castile, the largest kingdom, was under Spanish control after centuries of struggle. Seville, her strategic port city, was won in 1236 by Ferdinand III. He drove the Moors out in a merciless conquest, confining them finally to Granada. Ferdinand envisioned a Catholic Castile, but centuries would pass, his dream unfulfilled. At the close of the medieval age, Castile was a kingdom large in size, but still splintered by rivalries. The realm was a patchwork of far-flung nobles who were, in effect, independent warlords, each with his own standing army and local rule. Henry IV was its weak and ineffective ruler, and his mismanagement was legendary. He failed especially in his mission to consolidate power over the nobles. Inflation soared in Castile, and everywhere rebellions broke out. Aragon, another Catholic kingdom, bordered the Mediterranean to the east and the Pyrenees to the north. By 1472, Catholic power held tight control over Aragon. Ferdinand II became the undisputed heir to her throne.
Aragon to the east was more of a trading commercial kingdom with interests particularly in Italy, whereas Castile, which had less of a maritime tradition, was more of a pastoral economy with a strong agricultural tradition, although from the 15th century on it was developing commercial interests in the South Atlantic. They were very different countries. Aragon, the more commercial, the more eastward-oriented. Castile, the more agricultural, more pastoral nation, more oriented towards the Atlantic.
In this climate of feudal struggle, a young woman would rise to the challenge of leadership. Isabella, Henry's half-sister, was raised in the remote region of Aravelo. Henry had exiled her and her brother there because he perceived them as a threat. Isabella led a lonely life, devoting herself to the study of religion, Latin, and horsemanship in solitude. But now, after years of captivity, her long wait was nearly over. Many nobles recognized Isabella as the legitimate heir to the throne of Castile, especially after the mysterious death of her brother. Royalty from as far away as England began submitting marriage contracts. Isabella had become an important political prize. But even at the age of 18, Isabella had a far bolder vision for herself and for Spain than others could possibly imagine. She chose as her partner the young Ferdinand of Aragon. An experienced soldier and statesman, he was Isabella's intellectual equal and shared her vision of a united Spain. On October 15, 1469, in Valladolid, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile stood side by side in holy matrimony.
For centuries, monarchs both in Aragon and Castile had dreamed of the unification of the peninsula, the reconstruction of the old united Hispania, the Roman province of antiquity. And with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, that dream was almost realized, that these old ideas, which were often prophesized at the birth of every monarch, was at last nearing reality.
It's important to think about Ferdinand and Isabella as being real people. They were young when they married. She was 18 and he was 17. They had difficulty paying for their wedding. There was tremendous opposition to their marriage. And they were two people who in many ways had very different personalities.
On December 11, 1474, Henry IV, the King of Castile, died in Madrid. No successor to his throne had been named. Upon receiving the news in Segovia, Isabella quickly proclaimed herself Queen of Castile.
Ferdinand and Isabella were the Catholic monarchs who united Spain into the first modern nation state. And Isabella, the Queen, was a very remarkable woman, empowered in an age, as a powerful woman, in an age where women were not empowered.
It's often difficult to pinpoint which person was responsible for which action because they did so many things that were of such tremendous importance. But certainly Isabella was very decisive and very strong-willed.
Ferdinand had equal rights to be king in Castile, king consort in Castile, and took an active role in the internal administration of that kingdom. Isabel, on the other hand, had less of a role in Aragon. Generally speaking, Ferdinand was responsible for foreign policy, for the military, for diplomacy. Isabel took greater interest in religious matters.
She was more interested in imperial expansion than actually Ferdinand.
Throughout Henry's inept reign, nobles had been permitted to collect tax money in their own region. Very little found its way to the throne. Isabella could not accept this state of affairs in her kingdom. She and Ferdinand began a plan to realign social institutions under their authority.
There was an attempt to centralize justice through the creation of new institutions, new law courts, an attempt to centralize the legal code, an attempt, above all, to increase the wealth and the power of the monarchy at the expense of the landed nobility, which until then had controlled many of the towns, much of the local justice, as well as much of the taxation in the kingdom.
The three orders of knighthood were prestigious secretive societies that wielded enormous power, usually on behalf of the nobles who financed them. Their monastic strongholds were virtually impregnable. They presented an obstacle for a queen anxious to control the nobility. In 1476, the Grand Master of the Santiago Knights died. Isabella received word that the members were gathering in their fortress to choose a successor. She traveled on horseback day and night for 3 days to reach the knights in meeting, devising a plan as she rode. The traveling queen, as she came to be called, would often make such grueling journeys to achieve her political ends. Arriving at the fortress, Isabella entered boldly. In a brilliant maneuver, she used her position as queen to nominate Ferdinand himself as the new Grand Master. Stunned, the Santiago Order had no choice but to humbly accept this eminent candidate. As a result, much of their enormous resources were absorbed by the monarchy. Soon, Isabella would reform all three orders and at the same time create a national police force called the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood. Patrolling the roads and countryside, they were given free rein to deal with real or suspected criminals. More importantly, its agents became the monarchy's rent and tax collectors. The steady stream of revenue that the Santa Hermandad provided enabled the rulers to turn their attention elsewhere, to the Catholic Church, much in need of reform.
The Catholic Church in Spain, as in much of Europe in the 15th century, was in deep trouble. Trouble that would lead in Northern Europe to the Protestant Reformation. It was accused of corruption. It was accused as well of immoral conduct of priests and monks. And Isabel and the clerics who were closest to her took a major role in the reform of this church.
Ferdinand and Isabella replaced many of the inferior ecclesiastics with far more worthy people: scholars, historians, and scientists. Deeply devout, these new clerics were given important positions of power, sometimes corrupting power. Ever since she was a child, Isabella had been driven by two profound desires. The first was to be as deeply devout a Catholic as ever lived. The second was to unify Spain. Throughout her life, she had interwoven these two aims, so that unification of Spain had become as much a religious crusade as it was an act of patriotism.
We live in a time in which we are thinking very seriously about the kinds of roles that women have played in history. And we go and examine the life of a truly extraordinary woman whose power was very great, and attempt to see what she was like as a real person, what she was like, in fact, in her marriage, and in what sorts of ways, perhaps, we can begin to understand the kind of extraordinary power that she really did wield not only in her own time, but continues to wield over us in our time.
Now, with Castile and Aragon allied and at peace, Ferdinand and Isabella were ready to expand. Ringed by rugged mountains to the north, west, and east, and the Mediterranean to the south, Granada was a fortress created by nature. Moorish culture flourished within the mighty walls of the Alhambra. Exquisite fountains, gardens, and sculpture graced an oasis of tranquility that seemed far removed from the surrounding bleak terrain. Here was the last fragrant flower of the Moors, whose majestic civilization had once dominated the Iberian Peninsula.
The idea of conquering Granada, that last Moorish stronghold, was to complete the process of unification. The political and religious unification of the peninsula begun many centuries before. It was conceived of and designed as a crusade, a religious crusade.
On February 28, 1482, Ferdinand's army attacked Alhama, a town well into Granadan territory. In the dead of night, the small band scaled the walls of the fortress, overpowered the gatekeepers, and threw open the gates. By the time it was done, 1,000 Moors lay dead, and thousands more had been captured. 25 miles away, Mulai Hassan received news of the defeat. He quickly assembled an army of 50,000 men to retake Alhama, but failed. Thus began the 10-year crusade to conquer Granada. Ferdinand's technique was ruthlessly simple. As his army advanced, it destroyed everything in its path. Crops were burned. Towns and villages were leveled, and supplies were destroyed. In May 1485, after a 10-day siege, Ferdinand captured Ronda, a fortress in western Granada that had been considered impregnable. Its fall thoroughly dismayed the Moors. Soon Loja fell, and the Spanish army had grown to 70,000 in a groundswell of support for Ferdinand and Isabella's crusade. The death of the Moorish king Hassan split the kingdom between his brother and his son, whom the Spaniards called Boabdil. Ferdinand now reversed his strategy. In exchange for total surrender, the Moors would be given their religious freedom and be allowed to govern themselves. Reassured by the king's promises, the Moorish king agreed. At the gates of the Alhambra, Boabdil surrendered the capital city of Granada to Ferdinand. For the monarchs, the moment crowned 20 years of stunning victories on and off the battlefield. But the unfortunate Boabdil would be remembered forever as the Moor who relinquished an empire without even a fight.
On the 6th of January, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabel entered into the city of Granada. Down came the standards, the symbols of Islam, and up went the standards of Ferdinand and Isabel with a great silver cross to celebrate this momentous triumph. And in fact, that was the triumph. That victory was probably conceived of as the most important thing Ferdinand and Isabel ever did.
Flushed with their victories, the king and queen turned their attention to the repeated pleas of a sailor. For years, Christopher Columbus had gazed at the sea and dreamed of discovering a new route to Asia.
There's no accident that the final defeat of the Muslim Kingdom of Spain and the decision on the part of the Catholic monarchs to support Christopher Columbus in his western voyage both occurred in the same year, because it was not until the Spanish monarchy was free of this struggle against the Moors that they were able, in fact, to start considering how to go about forming an empire.
With the Queen's blessing and financing secured, he was finally able to make preparations. He sent for supplies from Seville and set sail from the port of Palo onto the open waters of the Atlantic. When he departed, Columbus carried with him Isabella's vision of a crusading empire. But no one could have foreseen that his unlikely encounter with a new world and the subjugation of its peoples would transform provincial Spain into one of the richest, most powerful nations in the world. Upon his return, the explorer presented the Queen with far more than exotic trinkets. He unknowingly handed her a continent, and most importantly, a new market for Spain's goods.
The basic principle of mercantilism, and it's a simple one, is that countries grow wealthy and powerful by accumulating gold. And they do this by exporting more than they import. The best way and most effective way of achieving this is to own colonies.
What was at one time a Europe that was centered around the Mediterranean and around commerce and politics within the world of the Mediterranean suddenly became completely and totally changed to the possibility of tremendous land areas laying out in the ocean, the size and the possibilities of which could not even begin to be measured in 1492.
The expansion of Isabella's Catholic empire was marked by an ominous beginning. On March 30th, 1492, Isabella decreed all Jews in Spain must convert to Catholicism or leave the country.
I think it's important to remember, when we look at this period of time just before Columbus sets sail and Spain becomes Catholic, that for 700 years prior to that, Spain, in various degrees, had lived in relative harmony with three basic religious groups: Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And that this was also going to represent a new era, an era of intolerance that would be marked by the Inquisition and other measures taken against people who did not subscribe to the Catholic faith.
It follows upon the conquest of Granada. If Granada represented, in one sense, the religious unification of the peninsula, the expulsion of the Jews represented the next step. The idea was to create a religiously homogeneous state, and the Jews represented a foreign element within that religious state.
The Spanish Inquisition was headquartered in churches and monasteries throughout Spain. A tribunal that depended on anonymous accusation and public humiliation, the Inquisition forced confessions of heresy out of its victims. Behind a facade of godliness, the inquisitors practiced methods of torture too gruesome to describe in order to cleanse the Catholic nation. Isabella's vision of a strong, unified Spain was built around this notion of a pure Catholic state. Her acceptance of the cruel methods of the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews posed a contradiction. On the one hand, she was dedicated to the arts and the improvement of education. But a rigid view of religion and willingness to give free rein to her clerics cost Spain cultural contributions and diversity beyond measure. The burning of Arabic books effectively erased hundreds of years of Muslim writing and scholarship. The eradication of Jewish populations removed scholars, writers, artists, musicians, and teachers.
The legacy that was left by the monarchs could be considered on the one hand to be the couple who during their reign decided to expel all of the Jews and the Moors, who decided to completely eradicate a Muslim kingdom in Spain, who decided to set in motion the events that ultimately would decimate the native populations of most of the Caribbean. Or we could think about Isabella and Ferdinand as being the great monarchs who created a united Spain, a Catholic Spain, a Spain that championed Christianity, that took the medieval crusades one step farther, and that created the possibility of an empire for Spain for 500 years.
Having worked so hard to realize their dreams of a unified Spain and a Catholic empire, the Spanish monarchs sought to create political alliances that would ensure the future power of Spain. By designing a series of marriages between their offspring and the great rulers of Europe, Isabella and Ferdinand hoped to lay the foundation of a strong Spanish dynasty. Young Isabella was married to the King of Portugal. Prince John, heir to the throne of Aragon, was paired with Margaret, heir to Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. Juana was married to Philip the Handsome, heir to the throne of Austria and Burgundy. And Catherine, the youngest of them all, would marry the next King of England. Yet, even the powerful Catholic monarchs could not control the destinies that awaited their children. One by one, Ferdinand and Isabella's children died. No male heirs were left to assume control of both Aragon and Castile.
Isabel was a mother, and she suffered and lived all of the experiences of being a mother and also being a wife. She was also an extraordinarily powerful monarch. And she tried to create an empire and tried to, through her own progeny, allow for the perpetuation of that empire.
But Spain remained in many ways disunited. It was called Las Españas, the Spains, and Aragon and Castile remained ruled in different fashions. More important to them would have been the fact that their dynastic alliances would benefit not their dynasty, but the dynasty they married into, the Habsburgs, who after the death of Ferdinand would inherit Spain and its empire in America and place a German dynasty with a Flemish prince on the throne in Madrid.
Tragedy took its toll on Isabella. Her beloved Ferdinand beside her, she descended into a long illness with no will to recover. Queen Isabella died on October 12, 1504 in Medina del Campo. She was borne through dark, driving torrents of rain south to Granada, the scene of her greatest triumph, where she was laid to rest in the royal tomb. 12 years later, on January 23, 1516, the body of the King of Aragon was laid beside his queen. A united Spain survived Isabella and Ferdinand. Over the centuries, the rolling hills of Castile and Aragon and the high crests of Granada would blend into one Spain. That vision and their dedication to it seals forever the Catholic monarch's prominent place in world history.
One must recognize that the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel brought to both to Castile and to Aragon enormous dynamism, energies that enabled Spaniards to dominate world affairs both in Europe and the Atlantic for several centuries. But dominion, empire, has its price in the form of high taxation that eventually ruined Spanish industry and Spanish economy. And the dream of a Catholic empire cost Spain its dynamic religious minorities, both the Jewish one and the Muslim one.
Isabel and Ferdinand were the monarchs of Spain who brought together many different regions, united these different regions under one crown, one language, one religion, and oversaw the creation of an empire.